Justin, welcome to the Dare to Multiply podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, Justin is somebody that I've interacted with over quite a number of years. We've had emails go back and forth. I've often used his resources for research and information, but we actually just met. I think it was in Kenya, not that many months ago. And yeah, it was great to meet you there. And yeah, it's always so funny when you've talked to people on Zoom or online, and all of a sudden you meet them in person, and you're like, "Oh, he's tall," or "Oh, they're short," or "Oh, they're different."
Not tall.
Oh, but I remember somebody I met. They're like, "Oh, you're so much taller than I thought you'd be." Anyway, but it's great to have friends that we've developed because we share a similar passion to see the nations reached and the glory of God cover the earth, disciple making movements, church planting movements, launching all over the globe. And Justin is one of the people who knows the most about what's happening where. I am so grateful for all the tracking that he does. He is a researcher for Beyond, which is an organization that is involved in DMMs exclusively, I think. And so many practitioners around the world. And we have the highest regard for Beyond and for what you guys do, but also serving with 2414, which is a collaborative work that we're also a part of. And Justin, I'll let you tell a little bit more about yourself, but just so you know, it's a real honor to have Justin with us here. We're talking about disciple multiplication, global trends today, and that's really our topic. And I'm really excited to hear your take on what is happening in the world. What is God doing? How can we partner with it and get involved as we think about the globe and what's happening today? So tell us a little bit more about yourself, though, from more the personal side, maybe first. How did you get involved in disciple multiplication and interested in this whole thing of DMMs, CPMs, microchurches? We'd love to hear a little of your story.
Well, I started out with a very small agency, which probably very few people have heard of, called AIMS, AIMS, which was a Pentecostal Charismatic Network. And while I was there, one of the people that we partnered with, I lived in Virginia Beach at the time, and he was a Brit and he knew David Barrett. And so in the early 1990s, he took me up to Richmond and introduced me to David Barrett and the World Christian Encyclopedia team. And when my wife and I married, we went to join the encyclopedia team and become part of that project. That's really where I became a mission researcher.
Did you meet Todd Johnson while you were there as well?
Yep. I worked with David and Todd and Michael Chafarian and others. So we were doing the second edition of the World Christian Encyclopedia. And David, amongst other things, really hammered into me, I suppose, a real passion for the unevangelized. David was, Dr. Barrett was extremely passionate about the fact that there were these, at the time, 1 billion. He would sign his letters, yours for the 1.1 billion unevangelized. Now, of course, it's 2.2 at this point. But back then, he was very, very passionate about that, and a lot of the encyclopedia work was documenting the unevangelized. So a lot of where my early missions career, if you will, started was in the heart for the unevangelized. After that, I worked with a number of different projects, and then my family and my wife and I have 4 kids, and we were in Southeast Asia for 4 years. And while we were there, working with a multi-agency team, doing, amongst other things, the Ethne conference and other things, research related. We started hearing little fragments, little bits about these rapidly multiplying movements. Some of them were very controversial at the time. There were just very, very small hints. And then after we returned from Southeast Asia around 2010, the team leader was Kent Parks, and he came back to take the leadership of Mission Unreached Peoples, which became Beyond, which is what I serve with today. And we came back, and it was around 2015 that Stan Parks, my boss, and Steve Smith, the late Steve Smith now, um, began to draw together a conference around these rapidly multiplying movements, a conference of people around this, and just kind of a working consultation. And they asked me to do the research to catalog the number of movements that were there at the time, and they both kind of used all of their connections to bring all that data together. And what we discovered was that at the time, everybody thought there was maybe 75, 100, maybe 120 movements. That's what everybody thought at the time. But when we finished the research, we found out that there was well over 500 in the world. And this was 2015, 2016. And the spread of those movements and the number of movements that had sprung up without people really realizing it really gave impetus to the idea that, those movements could engage every, or at least make a really, really strong stab at engaging every people in place by 2025. And that was the impetus of the 2414 coalition right there. And that's kind of how I got started. It was, I'd been kind of capturing little fragments of information about movements for a very long time. But in 2015, I began to meet a lot of people and gather a lot of information on it. And the more that we gathered, the more we were able to gather. And the growth was just exploding very, very rapidly. We kept uncovering more. I kept saying things like, well, this is great, but it's not here. I mean, here's this dark spot on the map. I don't know of anything here. And sure enough, I would find out, oh, yes, there's something there. And that just kept happening over and over and over and over again. And so that's basically what I've been doing now from 2015 through now, has been largely serving and helping and documenting the families of movements that we are aware of.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, how exciting that must have been to think, oh, there's nothing here. And then, doesn't God just love to surprise us? It's like, don't tell me I can't do it there, because I'll just show you that it can happen there as well. And when we talk about, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it really reminds us kind of the days of China, after the revolution and everybody was kicked out of China and everyone thought Christianity was dead in China. And then lo and behold, some decades later, when it opened back up again and people were able to find out, no, there's, over 100 million, perhaps, Chinese believers. So God does amazing things when we think nothing is possible, because we're not there to see it. It's okay. It's growing.
Yeah. Wow. And when we talk about something is happening, we're talking about multiplication of disciples. Maybe just, if you want to define what you call a movement really briefly, so people know what we're talking about what is it exactly that you're researching?
Sure. A movement is multiple streams of disciples gathering in churches. We usually measure it as they've reached 4 generations in multiple streams. For shorthand, I've taken to calling this a 4x4, 4 generations by 4 streams wide. Some of them are 3 or 2 or 6 or whatever, but it's multiple streams, multiple generations. When you have something like a 4x4, you are typically somewhere close to the threshold of 100 churches, or over the threshold of 100 churches and 1,000 believers. And that seems to be kind of the point at which it's going to continue. Usually, a charismatic leader can plant a church, and he can even really probably get to a generation of cell churches beyond the mother church, and maybe even 2 generations. But when you get to 4 generations, typically the 4th doesn't know anything about the first or the founder. And so you have to have implanted some DNA for multiplication to get to that 4th level. It's not charisma anymore. It is the DNA of multiplication. And if you've got that to the 4th generation, it tends to endure. There have been some cases where, persecution or other issues have caused problems, but by and large, a stream that reaches that level is going to endure. And so that's what we call a movement. Multiple generations, 4 streams, adding more every 18 months or so, 100 churches, 1,000 believers. That's about what a movement is.
Yeah, excellent. Well, and sometimes every group has their own little tweaks on this definition, so that's
Yes.
okay. But the principle is that there needs to be something significantly reproducing. And people are coming to the Lord. They're being baptized in significant numbers. It's not just 30 or 50. And it's not just one church that's a big church, but it's a movement that is starting to develop and emerge there. So good. Yeah, well, tell us, Justin, we're anxious to hear. I'm anxious to hear. I know the people listening. What are some of the most important or exciting trends that you see as you are looking at the globe today? And I know you research more than just movements. You are a reader and a researcher of what is happening in the world today. So tell us a little bit about those global trends that you're noticing.
Well, it's hard to watch trends today and not find yourself falling into looking at like Matthew 24. I don't believe that we're necessarily in the signs of the times. I know plenty of times in history there's been advance, and plenty of times in history there's been retreat. So I don't really want to fall into that thing. But we are seeing a lot of wars, a lot of natural disasters, a lot of plagues, a lot of persecution. And one of the most thrilling things is that, I don't know if any of your readers have ever read or read anything about, there's a book called The Black Swan. And one of the interesting things about this is the idea that a black swan is an event which is unpredicted and is just world changing. And a resilient organization can actually thrive off of a black swan where a lot of others will break. And one of the fascinating things about movements is that they tend to thrive in situations that would break others. In a lot of the wars, in a lot of the disasters, in a lot of the even in the pandemic, because movements have this DNA of going out among the lost and being a blessing and inviting people to encounter Jesus. But even before the encounter with Jesus, going out among the lost and being a blessing, because they have that DNA, they can really be right in the midst of these terrible disasters. So whenever you see one of these things, an earthquake, a pandemic, a plague, a war, if there's a movement around there, they might struggle for a little bit. The war in Sudan is a really challenging situation, but there's going to be some thriving that happens even in the midst of that, which is really incredible to see. One of the other things that I think is really amazing is that these movements really thrive off of people who are passionate for the lost. They have an apostolic passion. And so they're not passionate for their structure or for the way they do things or for the rules or the logistics of it. They're passionate for the lost. And so they're very entrepreneurial. They will tweak and they will move and they will experiment and they will try new things. And because of that, these movements are really kind of exploding over boundaries and over barriers. It's pretty amazing to watch. There's not a region in the world that doesn't have something happening within it, some kind of engagement. And most of the regions of the world have some kind of movement. Some of them very tiny. They might still be down at that 1,000 line, but the oldest movement in the world right now is about 30 plus million believers, which is just an amazing number when you think about it. And I think
30,000? Is that what you said? 30 million.
30 million.
30 million. Wow. And when you say the oldest, can you explain what you mean by that? I mean,
the one that's been around the longest.
The oldest modern one, or?
Yeah, the oldest modern movement.
Okay.
Yeah, it got started in the 1990s, and it is now north of 30 million believers.
Wow.
It's just an amazing thing. And there's 8 movement families right now. They're over 1 million members each. So, I mean, we talk about movements that are 1,000, but some of these big families of movements are made up of these small clumps. And one of the other amazing things about this too is that these movements are very intentional about sending out cross-cultural mission teams to start new streams. They'll
Right.
be in one language here, and they'll say, "Oh, but the Great Commission says, and so we must obey it," because that's what movements do. They read the
That's the
scripture
deal.
and they obey it.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
they'll send teams out to this language next door. And we've seen teams that cross religions. We've seen teams that cross languages. We've seen teams that cross political boundaries and go into places that people say you shouldn't go into. We've seen teams that cross caste barriers. And then, of
Yeah.
course, the fourth thing I would say is the signs and wonders aspect to movements.
Hmm.
Often challenges me as a Western. I mean, I grew up in the Pentecostal movement, but still, some of this stuff that you hear just really challenges the mind.
Hmm.
But when somebody is healed, then they want to know who healed them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the gospel could jump all sorts of barriers. If you've got a son or a daughter who's deathly sick and they get healed because somebody prayed for them, you don't really care about the barriers. You care about what happened right then.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, it's in Acts chapter 2, 42 to 47, how there were signs and wonders. It was part of the church and
Yep.
happening then, and it's happening now in many of these movements. And yeah, we want to see it happen everywhere where God pours out his spirit and shows himself to be real to the lost in really significant ways that get their attention. But I wanted to back up just a minute, Justin. You mentioned families of movements. That may be a new idea for some of the people who are listening. I know what you mean, but I want to just ask you to explain that just a little bit more, if you would.
Well, some of these movements have gotten big enough that, and they've sent out cross-cultural teams, and they do their own. I hesitate to call them. They're not exactly they're not denominations. Okay, so we shouldn't. But it's almost apples to apples comparison, right? So they're not really. Don't think of denominational structures or anything like that. But they're of a size where they are doing trainings, they are doing leadership development, they are doing caring for the poor, they are doing caring for the widows and for the martyrs, the families of the martyrs, and they are doing a lot of the things that an organized network of believers that that encompasses multiple countries, multiple cities, multiple provinces, multiple languages would do. And so we kind of call them families because one family of movements might have, they might be in 10 countries that are right around each other. And so they have a cross-border international, they may be training people in other regions. I've seen that happen. They may be, they're working on translations of scripture, they're working on media development, they're doing all these kinds of things. And so there's about 30 to 40 of what I call these families of movements that are ranging in size from some thousands up to millions and tens of millions of believers.
Right. Yeah. So they probably have a little less structure than a denomination would, but they are structured in some ways to go after the lost and to see more movements emerging and to serve the movements that are being birthed out of them as movements start movements that start movements. They have some kind of an identity together as being kind of from the same group of movements or the same family. Is that right?
Very, very loose identity.
Yeah, loose identity.
Very loose identity. It's certainly not, like branded. Obviously, most of these are house churches anyway, so it's not like you've got a brand name over the building kind of thing. But there is an identity, and there's definitely gathering
kind of leadership as well, wouldn't there be?
Yeah. There's definitely leadership that happens.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. We could do a whole podcast just on that, I'm sure. But tell me a little bit more. Just talk about research and tracking generally. Why is that important? I've had pushback sometimes when, we're trying to do tracking or find out what's happening, how many generations, how many churches and groups. And I'm sure you've had that pushback too. Tell us a little bit. Why does it matter? Why should we do that?
Well, part of it is to give witness to the wonderful thing that God is doing. That's part of it. But I would say right now, even the bigger part is, if you most of these movements are focused on what needs to be done in the area that God has called them to, right?
Mhm.
It's not so much about what we have done or what we are doing, it's what remains to be done. They were birthed
Mm.
out of a passion to see the unevangelized reached.
Mhm.
So the only way to really know where the gaps are, what remains to be done, is to basically know you have to have the comprehensive picture of the place that you've and the peoples that you've been called to, you know, and then you have to be able to say, okay, these are the places that we're working in and that we see that, where we see that there's stuff happening and it's sustaining, and then these are the places where nothing's happened yet. It's
Mhm.
kind of like, when you do a puzzle, like when my wife and I, we do puzzles, we put the border together first, so you've got kind of the limits of it. We've got a picture of what that puzzle is going to look like at the end, and she usually takes the buildings and the people at the bottom of the puzzle. We love Waisaki ones. And I take the clouds and the trees at the top. And so you kind of know when you're looking at this puzzle piece, okay, this is a cloud piece. It goes to me. This is
Mhm.
a person piece. It goes to her. And then you got to fit it all together. So research is basically trying to figure out, okay, what parts do we have are in place and where are the gaps? Just to give an example, my team and I, we were doing an analysis of two different movements that happen to kind of overlap with each other. And so in this particular location, there were a number of ADM threes, district level kind of. So ADM one is the country, ADM two is the province or state, and ADM three would be the district. In the U.S. It'd be like counties. So we were doing it at the district level. This movement is here, this movement is here. We put all the data together, and then 12 districts popped up, and these are what we call double reds. Neither one is doing anything. Okay, that becomes a piece of strategic information that's
Mhm.
really helpful to the movements to know. And what we've been really working on doing is helping the movements develop the capacity to do that themselves.
Mhm.
Some of the movements do have people in them that it's not a huge skill set that you need. I mean, it's not like you need a PhD to do this. You just have to be
Mhm.
able to have some decent relationships and be able to work a spreadsheet. Um, and if so, we're trying to help them do this same kind of analysis, so that, because when we say this is a double red, when we say this is a district no one's working in, you can bet within 6 months to a year somebody's going to have people going there, because that's how
Right.
passionate they are.
Yeah. Yeah. So identifying those gaps
Yeah,
helps release people to move and
yeah.
to strategically focus on them, and ultimately means those people are going to be reached who wouldn't have if that research hadn't come in, hadn't been done. Of course, we can have a Macedonian call. The Holy Spirit can lead them there, but research helps, right? When
Yeah,
we
it
have
does.
that in front of us, then it's like, of course, we want to go there. Of course, we want to mobilize some of our people and begin to pray for people to go into those areas. So appreciate all that you do with that. It's not an easy job to gather information, and it's not easy to put it all together either, I'm sure. So grateful for that. And yeah, it matters. Tracking gives glory to God, like you said. We witness, we
Yeah,
give witness to what He has done. I would always tell our teams in India, if you don't report in, we don't know how to celebrate,
yeah,
and we don't know how to troubleshoot or help you where you're struggling. So reporting gives that information that global leaders, like yourself, Justin, and many, many others who gather and work on this, will be able to, yeah, take initiative to resolve and see the world reached and the Great Commission fulfilled. So good. Um, let's talk about collaboration a little bit. You talked about two teams, two movements that were
mm,
working in the same area. Um, yeah, I mean, these movements are led by humans. We're all
mm,
human. And it's not always easy to collaborate. Sometimes, personalities get in the way. Sometimes, values may be really different,
mhm.
maybe even doctrine or denominational background that you came and grew up in. Yeah, talk a little bit about the collaboration, why it's so important, and maybe some of the challenges and how we can overcome them.
Well, I think you've listed a number of the challenges right there.
Oh, I'm sure you have more to add to the list.
Well, I mean, I think collaboration is something of a spiritual discipline.
Mm,
You know, I heard a story early on when in my missions career about you know the thing about you can go fast alone or you can go far together. But there
mm,
was another story where a guy said, you know, if you were gonna go from I'll just use U.S. terms. If we were going to go from Dallas to Houston, you know, we could drive that. We could fly it in, you know, about an hour. You just go down to the
mm,
airport, get on a plane, fly there, be there in an hour.
mm,
Or we could rent a bus and we could drive, you know, get everybody on the bus and drive from here to Houston. It's going to take about 5 hours, but we'd probably stop for a meal or a picnic along the way. And the point is that when we collaborate together, we build family identity. We can
mm,
go do something by ourselves, but that's not us becoming the body of Christ together. And I think the
mm,
discipline of collaboration is one where you know many people bring their talents together, but we also bring this discipline of being family. And being family is messy and difficult at times. It's a
mm,
challenge. It means we have to
mm,
practice charity, we have to practice patience, we have to practice all the fruits of the spirit. um, but the fruit of it is that it's not just us as individuals accomplishing something. It's us as individuals building a family that can last for generations and can model what real charitable cooperation together could look like in the kingdom.
mm,
Um, you know, sometimes it's about I have to give up some of the things that I maybe want in order to accomplish something that together that somebody else can agree to. Not having my own way, you know, fully. Sometimes it's a matter of us really praying together and discovering what it is that the Spirit is leading us to do, which might be totally different from anybody else, from what we anticipated when anybody in the
mm,
collaboration anticipated it being. Um, but endeavoring to have this collaborative spirit and work together, um, while messy and difficult, I think is one of the hallmarks actually of a lot of the movements. Uh,
mm,
they don't want to they don't want to be they don't want to be left out of the decision making. They don't want to just, you know, have you provide money and not be part of all the classical ways that things have been done in the past. What we really want, what they really want, and really we really want, is to serve one another and act as brothers and sisters, and each of us bring our talents and giftings to the table.
mm,
Um, One of the things I have found when I've worked with movements is I have to be careful to say what is it that you actually need,
mm,
not what I think, because they're so polite.
mm,
A lot of these movements are in Africa and Asia, and they're very hospitable and they're very polite, and they'll sense they have this ability. It's I mean I'm like blind in this area, but they have this ability to sense what it is you have to offer and to say that's what they need, but that might not
mm,
be what they need at all.
mm,
I think taking the time to really get to know each other and really say, okay, I know what I can do, but let's just set what I can do aside. What is it that what is it that you really need? It might not be
mm,
something I can do, but maybe I know somebody who can, or maybe
mm,
I'm just going to pray with you. I don't know, but what's the true essence of the situation here? And let's be brothers and sisters together. Let's
mm,
not, you know, be seeming to be servants. Let's actually be servants. Let's actually serve.
mm, so good. Yeah, it isn't easy, and yet, I really think 2414 does it really well. For those of you who haven't heard of 2414, I encourage you to, go check it out. You can just Google it, or maybe I'll put a link in the show notes. But Yeah, I've really seen such a collaborative spirit that's been promoted there, and you've been a part of that, Justin. And so, thank you for that, and a welcoming of different kinds of people into the collaborative effort. You know, there's a seat at the table for anyone, and really appreciate that. Yeah, it's not easy, but it's worthwhile. And like you said, it's a spiritual discipline. And I think one of the things I've seen is the reason it works so well is because these people, you know, and I'd say you and I included, we want to see the unengaged engaged. We want to see
Yeah,
the unreached reached.
yeah,
And we know that doing it together, we're going to get it done faster. You know, it's just worth the effort, worth the rub that comes sometimes to put our heads and hearts together and our whatever we have to offer, and let's go get the job done that Jesus gave us to do. So I think if
yeah.
we didn't have that focus, it might not work, you know, but because that focus is so clear, we're able, you know, to walk in unity and collaborate together. Yeah, wow, time is going by really fast. Let me ask you a quick question that I know a lot of people, it's probably on their minds. They might not want to ask it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Some people say that the claims about disciple making movements and what's
Mm,
happening in the world, I actually just read a quote that you said, Justin. I got it from your website in a church that I was speaking in, a big church in a city in Southeast Asia. And you know, some of those claims are so big, and the numbers are so mind-boggling. And you know, sometimes people say, "How, you know, is this real?" I'm
mm.
not sure it's real. And there's sometimes pushback. You know, are these numbers that are being talked about? Yeah, verifiable. So talk about that a little bit. How do you verify numbers, or when people submit them to you, and how
Mhm.
would you answer when people would say, I'm not sure. How can I trust your statistics?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that movements, there's basically kind of three levels of movements. There's the ones that are down around 1,000, 2,000, sub 10,000, right? And when you have a movement that size, it seems like a big number, but really it's not that much more than is in, a typical mega church. Like I go to a church, there's two services on a Sunday, and there's 750 uh, in the auditorium seating capacity. So that's, several thousand people are part of that church.
Mm,
And then there's kids over in the other building. So, there's several thousand. Managing that kind of number and counting that kind of number is a fairly straightforward process for any church or any network worldwide. And a lot of the movements in the world are around that level, right?
mm. What's a
So,
lot? What percentage would you say? Just a guess.
well, um, you know, 8 of the families are over 1 million members, and I think another 10 or so. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I think it's about another 10 or so are over the 100,000 level, and the rest would be under 100,000.
Okay.
Um, so something like half would be under that 100,000 level, down closer to 1,000 to 10,000. They're kind of
Sure.
getting started.
Right.
Some of them. Some of them are in situations of really high persecution too.
Mm,
Um, So at that level, it's a fairly straightforward thing to count. Once you get over 100,000, you get into the same kind of area that a lot of modern denominations are in, and the way they count is pretty much the same way that most denominations are going to count. They're going to have the leaders, like the leaders of the individual streams, networks, churches, are going to collect information, and it's going to bubble up a chain, just like when the Southern Baptists go to count Baptist churches, they have all their churches fill in a form, and then they send them to a central uh, state spot, and the state spot sends it on to the central spot, and there you go. It's not really any different from that. Once you get up into a movement that's over 10 million, well, those are made up of streams that again are 100,000 to 1 million kind of thing, and they individually can be counted and then that number brought together. But one thing we have to bear in mind is that once you're over, once you're if you have a dynamically growing movement, which these are, and they're over, 100,000, a million, 10 million, that number is changing all the time. It's
Mhm.
any number that they give you, or that, like the Southern
Be
Baptists,
different tomorrow.
or
Yeah.
yeah, or whatever. It's going to be a different number tomorrow.
Yep.
So it's never precise down to the last digit. And mostly, like if you go to look in the World Christian Encyclopedia, most of the denominations are rounded to the nearest 100,000 or the nearest million. And that's the level of accuracy that you can kind of assume for these numbers. I have sat and done, for a lot of these, I can't go and I mean, I'd run the risk of being killed, which would cut my work short, and my family would be very disappointed. Um, and other people would be killed too if I showed up in somebody's village to see a house church.
Right, right.
Um, but what I have done is I have been at training events where regional leaders have come in and where national leaders have come in and sat down and talked with them. I have been in places in multiple regions of the world. I've done some surveys in places where they brought in 100, 200 of their leaders. And I mean, you can't listen to these people and the stories. I sat across from one little old lady. There was a crew. There was 4 of them, and this little old lady was there, and she said, "Oh, I love getting arrested." And I'm like, "What?"
Why?
So I'm looking at the translator, going, "What did she? Are you sure that's what she said?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "I love getting arrested. I get to preach the gospel to policemen that I normally don't get to interact with."
Wow.
The others started laughing, and they're like, "Yes, when Auntie goes to the police station, by the time she's done, the policemen are asking, 'Auntie, will you pray for my cousin? He's sick. Auntie, will you pray for my nephew? He needs a job.'" And, I mean, they're just incredibly bold, not seminary trained, but incredibly bold evangelists and people with pastoral giftings. And you can't, there was one time I was sitting there and I asked the guy, I was interviewing him, and I said, one of the questions was about, have you encountered persecution in your area? Has there been persecution in your area? And he lifted up his shirt,
Mm,
and his entire chest was taped up from the last time he'd been beaten and
mm,
bruised, and his whole chest and his stomach were taped up. I'm thinking, I'd be in a hospital or I'd be home in bed. I asked him, "Why are you here?" Because he said, "Because it was important for the story to be told of what's happening."
mm, mm. Wow.
And I thought, I did, it revised my opinion of how they felt about telling the story of what was
Mm,
going on.
mm,
But it also brought home the cost they were willing to pay. I
mm,
mean, some of these people, there are martyrs in these movements.
mhm. Yep, they are.
Um, so have I gone and inspected churches? No, I have not. But I have applied the same rules that I would apply for a denominational survey in the West. And a lot of these movements too, they make the best estimate they can of the streams that are in there, and then oftentimes they'll reduce the estimate.
Mhm.
They'll cut the number down a bit because they just feel like they should, just to be safe, just to
Yep.
be conservative,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
don't really know very many Western churches that would do that.
Mm. Oh, so true. So true. And yeah, I would say too, I'm not a researcher like you, Justin, but having gathered data, from teams in the field over many, many years, I think the tendency is to underestimate, not
Yeah.
overestimate across the board. And so, yeah, but a lot of people in their context don't really realize the humility, the kinds of people that we are seeing these movements happen through. And so it's easy to doubt those numbers. So, really appreciate you
Yeah.
giving that explanation. today. And if people have more questions, they can write to you
Yep,
or
I'd be happy to answer questions. Really, we basically do the same thing with movements that we've done with denominate. I've been part of the World Christian Encyclopedia now twice,
Mhm.
actually calling denominations, getting the updated numbers. We do the exact same thing with them that we do with movements and vice versa. It's no different.
Yeah, yeah, so good. Well, tell us how people can get in touch with you, and you have some resources. I want you to talk about your Pray Weekly and also the Roundup. So tell us a little bit about those and how people can access them.
So yeah, so I mean, I love research and I do a lot of scanning of things, looking for information about where things are becoming more difficult to get into those places and where things are opening up and becoming easier to get into those places. And so I have a weekly newsletter that comes out every Friday. It's free. You can go to Justin Long, yeah, right there, justinlong.org/roundup. And it comes out every Friday. And it's basically a long curated list of what's happened in each of the regions. So we break it down: North Africa and West Asia, East Africa, so forth, all the way through the world. And it's what's happened that's kind of critical to know for this week. So it comes
Mhm.
out every Friday. Um, and then
Something
there's
I
also,
personally get and really appreciate, by the way. Yeah,
thank you.
really recommend.
Thanks. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of mission leaders and church leaders and people that get the roundup. They say it, really helps them to understand the context that their workers are
Mhm.
working in, and gives
Mm.
them kind of a heads up about events like the wars and things like that. We try to have a very realistic view, and
Mhm.
something of a rational and realistic view of the wars that are happening and the impact and how long they're going to probably continue on. Um, and then Deome, which is the Greek word for beseech, as in beseech the Lord of the harvest for workers. That's where we got the name from. It's a weekly prayer guide. So basically, we take the whole big roundup, huge newsletter, and we boil it down into 7 specific prayer requests for that week that are derived from the headlines for the week. We make those into prayer requests. It's one per day for the week. That comes out Sunday morning. That
Mm.
also is a free newsletter. So a lot of prayer groups will use that. They'll print it out and they'll use it in their Sunday school classes or what have you. Sometimes they'll pray through the whole thing on a Sunday morning, or sometimes they'll pray through it during the week and so on. But that's kind of taking what's in the roundup and making I call it an Operation World style prayer request, but for the headlines of the week. Somebody once told me that every headline is a prayer request, and that's
Mm.
kind of what we do with that.
Yeah, so
So
good.
yeah, both of
Yeah.
those at the website. There, you can sign up. If you find out they're not what you want, then you can unsubscribe. It's very easy, and yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Justin. It's been really great to have you on the show, and I know people have benefited. I've definitely learned some things today as well. And yeah, any last words, any last encouragements that you'd like to give to those who are listening? Maybe some who are just starting out with movements and trying to get their head around this whole thing of disciple multiplication.
Yeah. I think one of the things to think about is, um, for a lot of us who are just getting started, we don't often. One of the things we've thought about is we don't often have a lot of non-Christian friends.
Hmm.
There's a number called Dunbar's number where you can have 15 really close, intimate friends, and then probably about 100 people that you could recognize just if you were to see them. And it's interesting, if you were to take out a piece of paper and you were just to start making a list, go from 0 to 100 of the people that you recognize, you would know them. They wouldn't have to introduce yourself. You would just say, hey, um, how many of those are Christians? How many of those are not?
Mm.
And one of the things about Christians in general in the world is that we don't actually have a lot of contact with non-Christians. Christians do tend to
Mm.
come. We don't have a lot of contact with non-Christians. One of the reasons that movements grow so fast is that they are in places where they tend to have a lot more contact with non-Christians, and they have a heart for them. They have God's
Mm.
heart for people. If we want to see the kinds of things happen in the Western environment, there's a lot of reasons I think why movements aren't necessarily happening here. But in any particular environment, Western or non-Western, one of the things is how can we make the sacrifice of beginning to be around Christians less and around non-Christians more? That's the only way the kingdom expands into the non-Christian parts of the world.
Mm.
So meeting people and adding people onto that 100 name list that you know by sight, and then beginning to pray for those people, and beginning to pray that God gives us a heart to be out amongst the lost. I think that's one of the early steps that everybody has to decide whether they want to make or not.
Mm.
Do we want to stay in our Christian environment where we're surrounded by other Christ followers, or do we want to open up to unbelievers around us who we can be a blessing to and a light to?
Mm.
Kind of the early decision that everybody has to make. If we're not willing to make that choice, then
We're probably not going to see a movement in our
not.
area, or even a few handful of people come to Christ. Yeah, it starts
You know,
with being
a lot
friend
of churches
there.
in the West, if part of the challenge is, I mean, when you look at the baptisms on a Sunday morning, if most of the baptisms are children of Christian families, then there needs to be some reorientation. We had a baptism service in our church. A lot of kids getting baptized. I'm happy for that. I'm not saying stop that, you know.
Mm.
But if we want to see more non-Christians becoming believers and, you know, followers of Jesus and coming into the church, then we probably have to reorient some of what we do. It's a pretty big flag.
I love that question. How can we make the sacrifice of beginning to make the sacrifice of being with non-Christians more and with Christians less? And it is a sacrifice because it's less comfortable, probably less encouraging. It's going to be demanding of you. But how can we be willing to make that sacrifice, to say no to maybe activities that are uplifting, you know, and go engage with those who don't know